Lebanon on the brink, another day of fierce fighting as the army bombards Palestinian fighters holed up in a refugee camp. So who are Fatah al-Islam, and how far could the latest outbreak of violence destabilise a country already in political crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. The latest fighting to consume Lebanon is being described as the worst outbreak of internal hostilities since the civil war, which ended in 1990. On Monday, at least 9 people were killed and 20 injured as tank rounds and mortar shells fired by the Lebanese army pounded Fatah al-Islam targets. The fighting centred around the coastal refugee camp of Nar el-Barad, close to the northern city of Tripoli. Fighting in the city on Sunday claimed the lives of 27 soldiers and 15 Fatah al-Islam fighters. 15 civilians died in the crossfire and many more were injured. The security situation in Lebanon remains extremely fragile. High-profile political assassinations and the aftermath of last year's war between Israel and Hezbollah in the south of the country have provoked huge demonstrations. So is the conflict with Fatah al-Islam likely to add to the political instability in Lebanon? Let's take a look at the organisation and what it stands for. Fatah al-Islam is an al-Qaeda-inspired armed group which formed in November 2006. Its aim is to liberate Palestinians through what it calls jihad or martyrdom. It rejects anyone willing to negotiate with Israel. The group is based in the Palestinian refugee camp Nar el-Barad in Lebanon, but its 200 or so fighters are not all Palestinian. They've come from training camps across the Middle East into Syria and then over the border. The Lebanese government says the fighters are taking their orders from the Syrian government.
They're named Fatah al-Islam, and it's no secret that Fatah al-Islam is linked to Fatah al-Intifada, which is part of the Syrian security and intelligence apparatus. And cooperation between them is very strong.
But Syria denies this and has issued an arrest warrant for the leader, Shaka al-Absi. He's also been sentenced to death in Jordan for the murder of a US diplomat. Fatah al-Islam last hit the headlines in February when the Lebanese government accused them of being behind the bus bombings that killed 3 civilians. When Al Jazeera interviewed their chief, al-Absi, in March, he denied their involvement in the attack. He said the group didn't want to attack Lebanese civilians and that the government was just looking for an excuse to get inside the Palestinian camps. Al-Absi also said the group was in Lebanon to defend the camps. The Lebanese government is under pressure to enforce UN Resolution 1559, which calls for the disarming of all Palestinian factions. In March, al-Absi seemed at ease in the base, but that was because the Lebanese army hadn't entered the camp for decades. Well, I'm joined now from Beirut by Nizar Abdelkader. He's a former Lebanese army general and now a military analyst. Also there is Dr. Ahmad Moussali, a professor of political science from the American University of Beirut. And finally, by Nicholas No, he's the editor-in-chief of the regional online news service MideastWire.com. If I could go to you, Dr. Ahmad Moussali, first. Why take on Fatah al-Islam now? Was the reason, the bank raid, which was originally talked about, is that an excuse for something to take on now?
Yeah, I think it's not the real cause for taking on Fatah al-Islam. Actually, what happened, if you remember, about 4 days ago, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. David Welsh, visited Lebanon. And on his agenda, there were only 2 items. One is the presidential elections in Lebanon, and second, to curb the radical Islamic movements in the north of Lebanon. I don't think this is just a coincidence that things started collapsing in the north and the fighting that took place between the Lebanese internal forces and the Fatah al-Islam, and after that getting involved in it with the Lebanese army. So this is, I think, part of a renewed U.S. effort to clamp down on cells that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda and that they have fighters that are going back and forth into Iraq and coordinating their activity with Al-Qaeda within Iraq. So it's more of a regional problem or actually activity rather than a local Lebanese security issue.
Okay, Nicholas, no. part of a US effort there. How big a threat are Fatah al-Islam in reality? Are they a big military presence?
Well, I mean, as we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere around the world with certain terrorist events, a very small group that's properly equipped, that's dedicated to their cause, and that's dedicated to creating violence and havoc can actually reap a lot of serious consequences in various countries, and that certainly can happen here. Last night we had a terrible bombing in the mainly Christian Ashrafiyeh area, which killed one woman and injured dozens of others, which may or may not be linked to what was happening that day and the day before in the Palestinian refugee camp. But that is one example. People are arguing here it was a signal to the Lebanese state. It's one example of how violence can really be easily perpetrated by small, determined groups, especially in a country like Lebanon, where the domestic political fault lines are so extremely tense right now that really one group can potentially detonate the situation.
Nizar Abdelkader, you're a former Lebanese army general, so you know the strength and the weaknesses of the Lebanese army. Do you think that they underestimated the kind of reaction that they would get in this instance?
I don't think they have underestimated, but probably they were not really prepared for this operation. And the time looks like it has been chosen by the Fatah al-Islam, not by the army. Because, you know, the operation started with a limited police operation inside the city of Tripoli. And then really the Fatah al-Islam took the initiative and launched a series of attacks against army positions and really setting ambushes on some of the axes near the camp or even at far distance from the camp. So it has been to me that the Fatah al-Islam really surprised the army with an operation well planned by Fatah al-Islam. It does not really seem to me as a coincidence at all.
Okay, let's just recap slightly on this situation. Around 400,000 Palestinian refugees live in Lebanese camps. Now al-Barad, the scene of the current fighting, is one of 12 Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Each was set up nearly 60 years ago to house Palestinians fleeing the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, today, nearly 10% of the whole population of Lebanon live in these densely crowded camps. Unemployment here is extremely high. Palestinian refugees are forbidden to work in many professions and trades in Lebanon. Most are dependent on the United Nations for schooling, water and medical care. And peculiarly, the Lebanese army is banned from entering any of the camps. It was part of a deal signed 38 years ago, making the Palestinians responsible for their own security. In many respects, the camps operate as their own mini-states. Nicholas, is that part of the problem, that these camps are effectively areas which are no-go areas for the authorities?
Well, of course, that presents an immediate security problem, for sure. But it also goes to the heart of, as you just said, a long-running political problem in this country, which obviously has regional implications vis-a-vis the Palestinian or Arab-Israeli conflict that's been going on for decades now. So, yes, this is, at the simplest level, a basic security issue about the state spreading its sovereignty over its entire lands. But then it starts to hook into these domestic political battles, because what we have right now is the pro-government forces, the government and its various parties aligned with it, basically portraying, or the narrative that they're putting forth is that this is an issue of the sovereignty of the state. And when they put forth that issue, it goes right to the heart of the major political conflict in this country, which is not so much about the Palestinians, Palestinian refugee camps, but about Hezbollah and Hezbollah's right, or so they argue, their right to bear arms. And that's where we start to get into the domestic political fault lines in this country that have been extremely sore, especially since the last Lebanon-Israeli conflict last summer, but indeed since the Hariri assassination several years ago.
Dr. Ahmad Musali, is there a danger that this the turbulence that we've seen in the last few days actually spreads from a backlash from the other camps?
Definitely. I think if the army attacks continue to push forward, and I think if there are more casualties and people displaced, and as we watch on TV all this artillery and the firing at each other, I think the danger is not only limited to the camps. I mean, which is very likely, especially in Ain al-Hilwa camp in Sidon, where there is a camp that has a similar composition of radical Islamic fundamentalist groups that exist there, and they have been known for a long time to exist there, as much as we all know that there are radical groups like Fatah al-Islam in the North camp. So the possibility of expansion, I think, is very possible. The possibility of a Lebanese-Palestinian escalation of conflict is possible, because at a certain point, I think the Palestinians in the camp will, even if they are with the army, at least officially, but at a point, I mean, they will be under fire from the attacks by the government. So I think the situation is very tense. It could be escalated into explosions throughout the country, and as well as into the camps. And I think it is very, I mean, it has to be dealt with very carefully, because if you go after Fatah al-Islam, it means you have to clean up all of the camp, as well as the other camp inside it.
If I could bring back in Nizar Abdel Kader, do you think that the army should actually now break that rule, the agreement that's been there for years, that they don't go into the camps? Surely that would be a better way of trying to pin down these small number of people who are causing trouble, rather than shelling all the people who are in there.
All right. Myself, I see three options, three possible options. Each option has its advantages and its risks. For the army, for the Palestinian camps, and for Lebanon as a whole, you know. First, we have to determine whether we want Lebanon to be a failed state or to be a state. This operation really will decide what definition we will give next to Lebanon. The first option, I could see that the army will push and keep really encircling the camp until really most of the population, civilian population, will leave the camp, and then the army launch an operation to clean the camp and really extract these elements from inside the camp. The second option would be really to go back to a status quo, like keeping surrounding the camp and do nothing after a few days. And the third one really is take it in the long run and prepare a very special operation for the security services and for the special forces, really to mount a series of operations to clean the Beirut camp, and maybe later on move onward to Saida or somewhere else.
OK, gentlemen, do stay where you are. We're going to take a very quick break now, but in part two, we'll be looking at the turbulent political background to this latest violence. Do stay with us, all of you.